Hi everyone. Hi, afternoon. Thanks so much for coming. My name's Eleanor. It's really great to see you at this last Big Questions event of term. If this is your first time at Big Questions, it basically does exactly what it says on the tin. So each week we pick a different big question about faith or meaning or life, and we think it through a little bit. And this week we're looking at the big question of whether or not there's any evidence for the existence of God, and if there is, then what that evidence is. Michael Nicholson is going to come and help us give a short talk on that subject. Then there'll be some time for discussion around tables, and then there'll be a question and answer time after that. Michael studied here at Christ College, and he continues to work with students in Cambridge. So the number that you need to text in questions during the talk, if you'd like to do that, is on the stand here and on the pillars around, or you can just stick up a hand when the question and answer time comes. So without further ado, Michael Nicholson.
Super, thanks Ellie. Now I'm really sorry if you've come here expecting to hear Graham Shearer speak, who was the original speaker. Sadly, Graham came down with tonsillitis, and that's why you're stuck with this Northern Irishman. I should say that if I become too Northern Irish at any point, just raise a hand, get my attention in some way, and I'll tone it down. But let's get to our question. Evidence. Why doesn't God make himself more obvious? It's a good question. If God is there, then couldn't he be clearer? Couldn't he appear visibly or speak audibly? Here's something Richard Dawkins has said. God's existence or non-existence is a scientific fact about the universe, discoverable in principle if not in practice. If he existed and chose to reveal it, God himself could clinch the argument noisily and unequivocally in his favor. Well, why doesn't he? There's a survival film called The Grey, starring Liam Neeson, and near the end of the film, Neeson's character lies down on the ground and looks up at the cold grey sky and pleads with God, do something, prove it, show me something real, show me and I'll believe in you until the day I die. I'm calling on you. And he waits for an answer, but there's only the silent grey sky. We could talk about clues that point to God, the fine-tuning of the universe and the appearance of design in the world and our sense of morality and fair play. But let's be honest, those things are ambiguous. They might point us in God's direction, but they don't settle the question. And for some of us here today, this may be more than just a theoretical question. This may be a personal question. Maybe you're really searching for God, but this is your big frustration. Why doesn't he make himself more obvious? And so is it the case that God has left us in uncertainty? Is skepticism the best we can do? Why doesn't God make himself more obvious? Well, I'd like to unpack over the next few minutes what Christianity has to say on that question. And here's the first part of an answer. Christianity claims that God has revealed himself in Jesus. There's a story of a Russian cosmonaut who was one of the first men in space. And when he returned, he triumphantly announced, I've been to space, and God isn't there. Now, that might sound a bit silly to us, but C.S. Lewis replied to it by talking about Shakespeare. Think of Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Well, Lewis said that expecting to find God in space is like Hamlet looking for Shakespeare in the attic of his castle, which isn't going to work because Shakespeare isn't an object within the play, he's the author. And God is related to our world like the author is related to his play, not an object within it, but like the author outside it. You're not going to find him in space or in the attic or anywhere else. See, the only way Hamlet can get to know Shakespeare is if Shakespeare reveals himself. What if the author writes himself into the play? Well, on your table or chair, you'll hopefully have one of these. And if you could grab that, that would be great. It's an account of Jesus' life written by an eyewitness called John. And could you please turn to the first page? And do keep a finger in it throughout, because we'll be using it to answer our question. By the way, this is actually very festive, because the bit we'll look at has Christmas written all over it. I can't think of a more appropriate day to be looking at this. Anyway, I'm going to look at the bit at the top. Beside the big one, if you could read along with me. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we have this Word who is God. Now skip with me down to that little 14. Here's the big reveal. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We, that is, eyewitnesses like John, have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And finally, look down at little 17. Here's the payoff. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Well, this is the Christmas story. The Christian claim is that God has stepped into history as one of us. The author has written himself into the play. Jesus is God in the flesh. Now, before Jesus was on the scene, God revealed himself partially and bit by bit. If we were having this discussion then we would still be playing guessing games. But now that Jesus has come, says John, the days of smoke and mirrors are over. God has revealed himself. He's put himself out there. Everything is out in the open in Jesus. Merry Christmas. That's the Christmas story. Now, sometimes we think to ourselves, I'd believe in God if I could see him. And the rather cheeky reply John would give, I suspect, is, well, you could have. You were just born at the wrong time. If we were then, we could have seen Jesus walk around the place in full view of lots of people, doing the kind of things only God can do, healing the blind, raising the dead. Not exactly subtle. Now, unfortunately, we weren't around then, but people like John were, and they saw it up close and personal, and they recorded it. And we have his book in our hands. By the way, isn't it remarkable that we have a book about a Jewish nobody 2,000 years later here in Cambridge? This is the way we get access. Now, I don't have time to defend the reliability of this book, but conveniently enough, there was a big question earlier this term on just that, and it would be worth listening online. I'm persuaded this is trustworthy evidence and well worth considering. Let me just say, though, we trust historical testimony all the time. It is easy to think, I'm not going to believe something unless I see it firsthand. But history doesn't work that way. I mean, have we seen Queen Victoria? Have we seen the Battle of Hastings? No, but we weigh up the evidence and decide what makes sense. And on that, we don't expect absolute certainty before we'll believe a historical claim, do we? If I expected certainty before accepting something, my life would quickly grind to a halt. There is so little of which I can be absolutely certain. No, what I do is I expect to be sure enough. Is there enough evidence to persuade me? You could think of it like this. If I'm more sure than not, if I'm more than 50% sure of something, then it is a bigger leap to reject it than to accept it. Look, no one's being asked to take a blind leap of faith. That is not what Christian faith is. Christian faith is about assessing the evidence and deciding whether it's trustworthy. My point is that God has revealed himself in Jesus. This is the evidence, so this is where we're to look. You know, wouldn't it be a shame if we missed out because we looked in the wrong place? Wouldn't it be a shame if Hamlet was stuck looking for Shakespeare in his attic when all the while Shakespeare had written himself into the play? Well, God has revealed himself in Jesus. Through this is where we're to look. Now, you expected me to say all that, didn't you? You expected me to say that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Of course, I'd say that. But now you're thinking, well, Michael, if God has been so clear, then why don't more people believe? Why isn't God clear to me? Why isn't he clear to so many people? Well, Christianity explains that, though we may not like the answer. But here's the second thing I'd like to say. The problem is that we are unreceptive to God. In other words, why doesn't God seem clear? Well, the Bible would say the problem is not on his end, but the problem is with us. Let me try to illustrate this. Imagine someone in a room who is blind and deaf. Now, they have a visitor in there with them, as close as could be, as clear as day. And the visitor could do all sorts of things to get their attention. They could wave their arms in the air and shout through a megaphone, set off a signal flare. But it won't do anything, because the person is blind and deaf. They have no idea about the visitor. But let me change the illustration a bit. Imagine that we are the person in the room, and there's a visitor in there with us. But we so hate this visitor, we are so poisoned against them, that we want nothing to do with them. And we so can't stand the sight of them that we tie a blind cloth around our eyes, and we so can't bear what they say that we cover our ears with our hands. And so that visitor could be as close as could be, as clear as day, doing all sorts of things to get our attention, but we don't know, because we're blind and deaf to them, because we hate them. And that is the position we find ourselves in with God. We're blind and deaf, unreceptive, because we hate him. Now, I realize that might be really offensive. That might sound really sharp to suggest that we're not neutral when it comes to all this. But here's a quote from Thomas Nagel. Nagel is a philosopher who's also an atheist, and I think this is very honest. Here's what Nagel says. I want atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. It's very honest and self-aware, isn't it? See, the Bible's diagnosis of our condition is that we don't want God in our lives. We're prejudiced against him. We think he's a killjoy and a spoilsport who's out to ruin our lives. We want to be free of his interference. I don't want him sticking his nose in my life and telling me what to do. And so what do? We ignore him and airbrush him out of the picture. We don't want God. That's pretty close to what John says about Jesus, actually. If you could look back at page 1, here's the reception Jesus gets, down at little verse 9. The true light that gives light to everyone, Jesus, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Unreceptive. Now, this helps us with something. People sometimes say that if they saw a miracle, well, then they'd believe. There's not enough evidence as it is, but if I saw a miracle, something spectacular, then I'd believe. The thing is, though, that has been tried. Jesus did miracles as clear as day, stuff that clearly shows he's God, and most people didn't believe in him. Some killed him. See, they had all the evidence they could need, but the problem isn't lack of evidence. It's that they didn't want to follow where the evidence leads. They didn't like it. They're unreceptive. Like Nagel says, he doesn't want there to be a God. We don't want God in our lives. And so when God clearly revealed himself in Jesus, what did we do? We killed him because we're unreceptive. I wonder what you make of that. Now, it is possible that we'll insist that the problem isn't with us, but is with God. I help at a discussion course about the Christian faith, and it's great fun. I love it. But I think every course, a question comes up along the lines of, well, I get there's some evidence, but why not more? Why did Jesus come then and not now? Why did God do it that way? And it is possible to ask that as a genuine, open-minded question, seeking an answer, and that's a good thing. But more often than not, It's less a question and more a complaint. Finding fault with God, putting God on trial. Why did you do it this way? Now, I want to say that if we put God on trial like that, then we both overestimate what we deserve and underestimate what God has done. We overestimate what we deserve because God is under no obligations to us, especially considering how we've treated him. Suppose that someone stubbornly ignored you. Well, why should you go out of your way to do anything to get their attention? It's a wonder God does anything at all. And it also underestimates what God has done. Think about it. If God is God, then for God himself to condescend to a cradle, never mind a cross, is not a small thing. It is not a small thing for God himself to become one of us. That's like us becoming like an amoeba, I suppose. Even that doesn't get it across. The point is that God has gone to the greatest lengths to make himself known. We are very lucky he's done so much. And so can I gently say, how arrogant if I insist that God should dance to my tune and play on my terms and reveal himself my way? If that's my attitude, then why should he bother with me? He's already bent over backwards to make himself known, and if that's not enough for me, then no wonder he seems unclear. Apparently, the philosopher Bertrand Russell was once asked how he would explain to God that he didn't believe in him if it turned out that in the end God exists. He replied, "I would look him in the eye and say, 'Not enough evidence.'" Well, can I gently say that that is foolish? No one will say that when they meet God. One day, God will be inescapably clear, and on that day, I will not dream of finding fault with him. It will be very clear that he is not the one on trial, but I am. Now, don't get me wrong. It is possible to ask that question in an open-minded way. Why did God do it this way? Why reveal himself through Jesus the way he did? That's a good question. A few weeks ago, I was standing on Midsummer Common, enjoying the 5th of November fireworks display. Now, I expect all of you were being studious and working hard, of course, but if you were there, you would have seen it was a great display, eye-catching, impossible to ignore. Well, why doesn't God do his own fireworks display? Something spectacular, something that would leave no doubt about whether he's there, something that would prove beyond any doubt that God exists. Well, here's the reason why. We need more than a divine fireworks display. See, our greatest tragedy in life is that we don't want to know God. Because far from what we think, he is not a cosmic killjoy out to ruin our lives. He is good, and he loves us, and he wants the best for us. In fact, like little verse 4 says, in him was life. Having God in my life won't ruin it. It is life itself. To be in relationship with him is real life. And so the tragedy is that I push God away. That is cutting myself off from life. That is death. Knowing God is life, rejecting him is death. And so do you see why God does not do a big fireworks display? It wouldn't really help us. Suppose God did do it, something that proves beyond doubt that he's there, and we all believe that he's there. We all think he exists. Well, so what? I might believe God exists, but it doesn't make me any more receptive to him. It doesn't mean I'll want him in my life. It's perfectly possible to believe God's there and go on rejecting him. And rejecting life itself, I'm still left with death. Fireworks don't help me. And this is why God has revealed himself as he has, to make us receptive, that we might have life itself. So for one final time, take a look down at little verse 12. Speaking of Jesus, verse 12, yet to all who did receive him, to all who wanted him, who welcomed him into their lives, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. See, even if a fireworks display can show me God exists, they can't tell me what he's like. But God in the flesh does. Jesus shows me not only that God is there, but that he's good and wise and loving, that he'd welcome people regardless of race or sex or social status, and do them so much good that he'd tell the truth and refuse to compromise, even when it makes him enemies, that he's tender enough to weep over death and powerful enough to undo it, that he's brave enough to die for his friends, though he could easily escape it. He's humble enough to wash the feet of his betrayer. He loves us enough to die for us. And he's far from a killjoy, by the way. What kind of spoilsport would turn 100 gallons of water into wine? Well, that is the God that we see in Jesus. And as I see Jesus in these pages, I think to myself, I don't want to be free of this guy. I want this guy in my life. He's the best. In other words, God has revealed himself this way so that I might see living proof of how lovely he is and gladly receive him. And having received him, have life itself. See, there is truth in saying that we need a miracle to help us believe in God. Our mistake is in thinking we need spectacular fireworks out there before our eyes. But the miracle we need isn't external, it's internal. We need to become receptive. If you like, I shouldn't say, God, do a miracle, something that will prove you're there. Instead, we should read about Jesus and say, God, please help me to read this with an open mind. Please overcome my prejudice against you and help me to see Jesus for who he is. Well, that's all from me before question time. I think Ellie's going to come back up and we'll have some time for discussion on tables and then questions.
We've got a couple of texted in questions, but if anyone has a question from the floor, first of all, stick up a hand. There'll be a roving mic coming around to you. Any questions from the floor? Yeah, one there.
Hi, thanks for the talk. What would you say of the possibility that not everyone in the world might have had an exposure to God, to Christ, this ability to understand him and believe in him?
Yeah, that's a great question. And God is fair. He's more fair than we are. He won't hold people responsible for neglecting something they haven't neglected. But the Bible would say that we all have access to some knowledge of God through the world he's made, through our conscience, our sense of right and wrong. But we deliberately look away from those things, evade them. And so that's the boat we're all in. Some people haven't heard about Jesus, and so God isn't going to hold them accountable for rejecting Jesus. But we have, and we're very lucky to have done so. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We're very privileged. And incidentally, the whole thing of people who haven't heard is the reason why your friends put on events like this, because they love you and want you to hear. It's the reason why Christians go halfway around the world to tell people about Jesus.
Thank you. I think there was another one down here. Yeah. Oh, sorry, just wait for the mic.
I was just wondering if you because you mentioned about, the evidence about life of Jesus and miracles and so on, and I just wondered if you could, if you'd like to talk about, the other the saints and stuff that's in the Christian tradition that's supposed to come after Jesus, also doing miracles and stuff, and it's like you do get supposedly miracle events happening after the life of Jesus. I just wonder why you you don't get so in theory you should get people, these new saints coming along and doing miracles today, but that doesn't seem to be happening very much. So I just want you to talk about that a bit. Why don't we get people doing miracles now? If you throughout history, you're supposed to have Christians doing miracles and stuff, and that's evidence of God.
So why don't you get people doing miracles now?
Yeah, that's the idea. Why didn't that happen?
Do forgive me if I haven't understood your question.
Okay.
But well, like I tried to say in the talk, miracles don't ultimately fix our problem. So they might draw our attention to something, perhaps to God, but it doesn't make me receptive to him. When Jesus did miracles, the purpose of them was to highlight something about himself, like they're signposts to his identity. That was their purpose, like he would multiply a crazy amount of bread and then say, I'm the bread of life. I'm the one you need to consume to have true life. And in Jesus' absence, I guess a miracle fails to highlight something about him. The way we get access to them is to read this and see what point the miracles were making. Is that answering your question?
Sort of. I suppose it kind of depends on what kind of Christian you are, whether you kind of believe that other people apart from Jesus did miracles, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, so the Bible would say that supernatural things happen. They're not always from God. They could be from other sources. And so miracles are kind of inherently ambiguous. By the way, I'm not saying that everything that's been claimed to be a miracle is authentic or something. Lots is just hogwash and out to fool people. But they're ambiguous. Yeah.
Cool, great. If we could go for one texted in. It says, why does an all-powerful God not just make us receptive to him?
Yeah, good question. I suppose God does give us the dignity of choice, and he doesn't so much want to force us, but to win us over. He wants to woo us to him. That's why he's demonstrated what he's like in Jesus, so that we would read it, and as he makes us receptive, we'd gladly come to receive Jesus, rather than have our arms twisted into it. Yeah.
Would anyone like to come back on that? Or yeah, at the back there.
If I'm convinced, what do I need to do about it? Is there some sort of magic formula? Or, yeah, what?
As in if you're convinced Jesus is God and that sort of thing? Well, I suppose what we looked at, to all who received him, who believed in his name, that would suggest that what I have to do is, I suppose, say to Jesus that I want to receive him and trust in him, rely on what he's done on my behalf. Now, you need to know some things before you do that. You need to know what he's like. But it is fairly straightforward. You trust him much as you would trust in another person. You want him to be your friend, receive him into your life. It's worth chatting with a Christian friend about that, probably. Ask them what they did.
I think there was another question down here, yeah?
Hello. You said at the beginning of one of your answers that God is fair. Is he not just but unfair? So, for example, not everyone has the same revelation of God. They don't have the same amount of information, which is unfair. But it's still just to punish them, for them to bear the punishment of their own rejection of him. So it's Can you say that God is fair, or can you just say that he's just?
I suppose you could put it that way. It is worth saying, perhaps, on that, God is just, and he would do no one a disservice by giving us no revelation of him at all. For him to give us any is more than fair, it's kind. It does mean we're very lucky. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go in for another one texted in. Why do you think we're unreceptive to God when other talks have said we're lost without him?
Yeah. So the Bible uses a variety of images to get the truth across. And they're not contradictory, they're complementary. So this idea of lostness being that I find myself apart from God and I need to be reunited with him. Nonetheless, the Bible does say that at heart, left to ourselves, we are unreceptive to God. We don't actually want him. And lostness is something like a willing lostness. For someone to come back to God, they need their heart to be changed. They don't just need to hear about him and be persuaded intellectually.
Would anyone like to come back on that or have another question? Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I don't know, whoever asked the question, that maybe a helpful kind of allegory is the parable of the prodigal son, about how, we choose to run away from the Father who loves us, and then, being found by him means returning. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Okay, maybe we've got time for one more then. I don't know if you're an expert on this. Is the Koran less reliable than the Bible as a historic source?
Well, I should put my hands up and say I haven't read the Koran, so I don't want to claim expertise I don't have. I reckon do listen to that talk from earlier in term. Is John's Gospel historically reliable? Because the guy who did that is an expert in most things. But that's an exaggeration. What I would say is that Christianity and the Gospels are pretty unique in that they're historically verifiable. What I mean is that most religions of the world claim a revelation from God, but it's essentially a private revelation behind the scenes, like in a dream or a vision, or in the case of the Quran, an angel dictating to Muhammad the content of the book. And it could be true, it could not be true, but the thing is we can't scrutinize it, we can't get at it. You know, if your friend tells you they've had a dream and here's what they dreamed, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but you can't know. It's not verifiable. The thing about Christianity is that it makes its claims tied to public historical events. It says that Jesus actually walked around and did stuff and died and rose from the dead. And those are events that you can verify and get at on the record. Christianity is vulnerable to criticism precisely because it is out in the open and verifiable. You can scrutinize it and test it. So that's what I'd say.
Brilliant, thanks very much. I'm sorry that we didn't get on to all your questions, but feel free to stick around as long as you like, chat around them on tables. And Michael will be around after the talk too, so if you want to talk to him, that would be fine. There might be a couple of ways that you might want to keep thinking about these topics. So I'm just going to outline a couple. There are some books on the way out. These are written by Christians and they're free for you to take away about the subjects that we've been thinking about today and related issues. So have a look on the way out. The books on the table as well, they're free for you to take away. Might be a really good opportunity to just start looking at the person of Jesus. Pick it up, have a read, chat to someone about it. There are also some feedback forms on your tables. We love to hear what you have to say, so do pick them up, write whatever you think. And there's a box to tick that says, I'm interested. That's if you want to meet up with someone from the Christian Union and chat a bit more about what you've heard. Just leave your name and your CRS ID and someone can get in contact with you. This is sadly the last big questions of term, but it's not the last event that we're putting on. There are some flyers for the carol services that are coming up on Monday and Wednesday on your table to help you get you in the Bridgemoor spirit. They're going to be at Great St Mary's at 10 p.m. But for now, feel free to stick around or rush off as you need. Thank you very much for coming.